and invite to speak, she says, "You've got to get Derek." And so I called him right away, and he very quickly agreed to come. So we're thrilled about that. And if you read his short bio on here, my favorite sentence, bar none, is his daily agenda is to challenge conventional wisdom and methodological chicanery as they manifest themselves in educational research, policy, and practice. And of course, there's none of that in journalism. I noticed you didn't have journalism on the list, so I felt relieved by that. No, but he's a professor of quantitative methods and policy analysis at University of Colorado Boulder. And also, interesting and relevant for this conversation, he serves on the technical advisory committees for several assessment consortia, including PARC and Smarter Balanced. So with that, he's going to talk for a few minutes, and then I'll ask a few questions and open it up. And this will be a 30-minute session. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I'm glad to be here. It's a really nice opportunity to get to talk to people that I usually only get to see over the phone when I get phone calls, so it's nice to actually have a little interaction on this. My plan for today, especially, well, initially I thought there would be more of a panel, but I'm a little bit grateful. As a professor, I like to have the floor. So it's nice here that we can have a little bit of a conversation, and I get to be the one to answer. And then I guess later you'll have Erik who will give his perspectives as well. But we had a little bit of a preparatory phone call and discussed some of the questions that I think a lot of you had already raised to Emily as something that would be of interest. And I found that we had a great deal of common ground already there, so I don't think we're going to be saying things that contradict each other very much. I don't have a really presentation prepared. I really would like this to be as interactive as possible, and I think some of the questions I prepared are good ones to get a conversation going. I'd encourage all of you who are out there to feel free to interrupt with questions, and so we can make this as interactive as possible. I will just give you a little bit of context as to what my connection is with the Large-Scale Assessment Consortia and the role that I play on the Technical Advisory Committee for those consortia. As Erik mentioned, I'm on the TACs for Smarter Balance, for PARC. Also, sometimes people forget that there are more than 2 assessment consortia out there. There are also 2 assessment consortia for the 1% of students that qualify for taking alternative assessments, or the alternate assessments, I should say, not alternative. And that is NCSIC, the National Consortium for National Collective. I actually have a hard time remembering the acronym for NCSIC. But there's NCSIC, and then there's a DLM. I do remember the acronym for DLM. That's the Dynamic Learning Maps. So those are the 2 alternate assessment consortia. There are also 2 consortia for English language proficiency exams, ELPA 21, and I think there's another one called Access. So I'm also on ELPA 21 and NCSIC. So when it comes to consortia, I know a lot about what's going on behind the scenes. And the involvement I've had with that has been really since the inception of the idea there would even be consortia. TAC was formed, and so I've been meeting with those groups for the last 4 to 5 years since the idea of assessing the Common Core was just a glimmer in everyone's eye, and sort of getting to see from the ground up just how mammoth the undertaking has been to try to get an assessment that was trying to, number one, just to get something out the door with a large-scale assessment is a pretty daunting enterprise, especially daunting when you're trying to at once organize and herd cats among all these states to get them to come to agreement, but also to be trying to push the envelope and doing the whole driving principle for assessing the Common Core and for what the Common Core consortia are trying to achieve is that you can't just be doing the same thing. Everything has been, well, okay, but how is this going to be different from what's been done before? And so that's been a driving principle behind the design of the assessments, the use of what's known as sort of the jargon in the assessment landscape and psychometrics is evidence-centered design as a principle for how these assessments have been created. And then seeing that unfold, there's been so much of an emphasis on these new assessments of not just the use to make inferences about students, although that's certainly critical aspect, but there's such an awareness that this is also going to factor into educator evaluation systems and educational accountability, and that these tests are likely to figure into that. So that's posed some real challenges, I think, for those designing these assessments, because it's actually quite challenging to anticipate potential misuse for educator evaluation. It's much easier to design an assessment thinking about what inferences you can make about students, far harder to then think about how aggregates based on that information will be used to evaluate schools and teachers. So let me stop there because I could certainly ramble on about some of these issues, but I'd rather have it be more directed towards questions and conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Derek. I'll start with just sort of a big picture question. If you can say a little bit from your own standpoint, with the PARCC and Smarter Balanced assessments, to what extent are they a significant departure from most states' prior tests? And what are some of the key things that would be notable about that?
Right. So, there's sort of two sides to this question. It's a very important one. First, the one way in which they're obviously different is that they've been written to what is supposed to be a different set of standards. So I think the last speaker was just talking about this sort of issue. But there is this belief that in writing the Common Core state standards, that there was a shift from having standards that typically were written from state to state to emphasize breadth to the Common Core, which would place somewhat of a greater emphasis on depth. So as a starting point, it's very important when you're talking about how are these tests different to think about what has been the target. What is the target for inference about students? And I think one of the things that's a concern is that sometimes teachers don't always see, and administrators don't always see that there's a difference between the tests that students are taking and what it is you actually want to know about students. Right? And the test can only reveal a glimpse of what you really want to know about students. And the standards, the Common Core state standards, are meant to capture really the ambition, and the test can just give you somewhat of a glimpse or an insight towards that ambition. So the first thing that's clearly different is the ambition behind the test has changed. It's changed in the sense of the depth versus breadth distinction. It's also changed in terms of what the end goal is. Previous state tests have really been oriented towards the notion of minimum proficiency. What is the minimum that we expect students to be able to do when they finish high school? The new tests and the Common Core are very much oriented towards what does a student need to be successful for college and career. So that's one. So getting down to making this less lofty, what are specific ways that the tests are different? Specific things that are different, if you look at the blueprints, you could say that on mathematics, the things that are really different about mathematics, as you see much more explicitly mentioned, the idea that what we want to see kids do is reason and model. Those are the two things, right? So there's always been content in mathematics, and to be honest, while I think that the tests in the Common Core have tried to focus on particular focal areas in mathematics more than the past, a lot of the content you'll see overlap. So if you were to compare the PARCC and Smarter Balanced tests to existing state tests, I think you would see a lot of the same content still there. Maybe shifted in grades a bit, but some of the content's there. What should be different is an emphasis on not just the content, but what kids can do with the content. And that's where reasoning and modeling is particular claims. If you look at the way that the PARCC test, for example, has been designed, they have on their website what they call a claim structure. What are the claims we want to make about students on the basis of their test scores? And two of the explicit claims that are written in there are claims about how students can reason, how students can model with mathematics. Right. I would say that with English language arts, the claims are not necessarily that different in terms of what has been there in the past. Right. I think we've always had claims around English language arts that have related to reading comprehension of informational text and of literary text, and things like vocabulary and interpretation. And we've always had probably claims around how well students can write and convey information and persuade and things like that. What is a little bit different is the switch towards having a much larger, I'd say, increase in the kinds of essays that, number one, students are expected to read and respond to. If you take any of the practice tests, you'll be overwhelmed by just how much reading is being asked of students. These are not just short paragraphs that students are expected to read. These are essays that students are expected to read and respond to. So much more emphasis on that. There's also much more of a compare and contrast focus on looking at two different essays and comparing those sorts of things, being able to then write persuasively as part of the performance-based assessment that follows from that. And you'll see a lot, if you look at any of the sample tests that are out there, a big emphasis not just on finding the right answer about a passage, but then defending it with evidence. That's a running theme. So again, you could see in this last thing that I've mentioned, similarly in mathematics, I've focused on not just content, but practices. You can see a little bit of that emerging in the English language arts as well. not just what you can identify or what you can answer correctly. How can you defend it with evidence, and how? So those are, I think, two ways in which I'd say the tests are probably quite a bit different from what's.
Thanks. One thing, and you've been on these advisory panels, so you probably saw the initial vision of these assessments, and I know as sort of the political reality settled in, they said, well, okay, it's not going to be as long. Well, these are too expensive. So they've had to make quite a few trade-offs. How far has that affected the quality and delivering on the early promise of truly more sophisticated assessments that are going to do a better job of gauging learning?
Right, quite a bit, right? I mean, it's a really tough tension and trade-off. So let me put it this way: if you start from a standing point that there's an agreement, perhaps a societal agreement, that it's important to assess students, it's important to give a large-scale assessment each grade. You might not agree with that, and there might be others who don't think that's a good use of resources. There are better ways to do that. But let's have a starting point. There should be an assessment. And so a complaint then, if you're going to do that sort of assessment, is if you just give a multiple choice test, how much are you going to really learn about depth as opposed to breadth? How is it possible to get at things like reasoning, modeling, using evidence to support, to defend statements? Can you really do that with a selected response multiple choice test? And many people will say, no, you just from a face standpoint, face validity standpoint, that seems implausible. And so then the answer you would give, if you still believe it's important to give the assessment, and you're concerned that if it's just multiple choice, teachers will have an easier time narrowing the curriculum, teaching to the test, then the answer is make it a much better assessment, right? How do you make it a much better assessment? Well, you probably want to build in more performance-based tasks, right? And the problem is the performance-based tasks are more time-consuming. If you really want to get a better insight as to what students can do, how they reason, how they model, you're going to have to take more time. And so then the problem becomes that, to get this more information, it involves more time, and people don't want to put the time in. So you could have a system where you just say we shouldn't be doing student-level assessment every year. But that's maybe not the best way to use resources, and that changes the conversation. But if the starting point is, yes, we have to do assessments every year, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, yes, we have to do assessments every year, and we want them to be rich, and we want them to really capture in some detail what students know and can do. And then you can't complain to say, well, that's going to double our testing time, right? So that's where the tension is. And to some extent, it would have been nice if it never works this way politically. I think it would be nice if at the outset, when states were deciding whether they wanted to join the different consortia, whether there had been some meeting where they said, each state, reveal to us what is the maximum number of testing hours you're willing to give up, right? And have that come to the table. And so they just would have had some consensus before they did anything else that just says, here is our constraint. We have to build a test within this time allotment. Unfortunately, that just never seemed to quite happen. And it's sort of amazing, right, that at this late stage in the game, there are states that are just now becoming aware that to be part of the consortium would necessarily involve more testing time. But the thing is, it's not a consortium issue, it's a Common Core of state standards issue. If you really want to assess these things at a deeper level, it's going to take more time. So you have states that dropped out of the consortia and they've gone to other vendors and said to them, assess the Common Core. And the vendors have said, well, okay, if I want to do that, I'm going to have to spend more time. I'm going to have to have kids writing essays and the like. And so they're back to the same amount of testing time as they would have if they'd stayed with Parker or Smart Balance. So,
one question I know that has been raised by some reporters is this spring is obviously a big time for Common Core testing in a lot of states for the first time. What's your advice for reporters? One of the challenges is this is sort of the baseline year. So compared to what? Right. How can reporters write about this in a compelling way, and what are some of the things you think they need to have in mind when they get those results?
Yeah, when I got that question, I've been thinking about that for the last week, about sort of what is the thing to look for, and I'm almost worried about the question because it makes it sound like you're looking for that smoking gun of something that's gone wrong. And I would actually say that the things that you should be paying very close attention to are probably not things that will appear in the score report, for the state. So if all you're looking at is they will have performance levels on these assessments, and if you're looking for what % of students are on track to be college and career ready in each grade, I don't think there's anything specific. It's likely that those percentages will be relatively small, right? So is that a sign of a problem? No, that's what I'm pretty expecting to happen. So until you have, as you said, more of a trend, it's really hard to know what to make of that. What I think is problematic, and this is a little bit of the reporting that took place in New York. New York was one of the first states to adopt tests for the Common Core. They've had 2 years of results. In the first year that they came out, what I saw in the reporting was that reporters seemed to make an equivalence between, they would look at the performance levels that were written to the new test, and then instead of reporting, well, there are 3 performance levels and here are the percentage at each level, reporters essentially went to the performance level that was indicative of being college and career ready and turned that into a pass rate, right? And so essentially said, well, let's look how many kids are at that threshold or higher, and that's the pass rate for the state. And then prior, they would look in the years before when there was a different test, and then the performance level was all connected to minimal proficiency, and they turned that into a pass rate, right? So if you do that, what do you think happens? Well, pass rate dropped, and that's inaccurate. I mean, that's very misleading, and that's really undermining sort of the whole enterprise. And the reason it's misleading is because, number one, 2 different sets of standards that the tests are being written to. 2 different focuses and foci in the way that the thresholds are even set. One's minimum proficiency, one's being prepared for college and career. So turning it into a pass rate makes it sound like, for each kid, they either passed the test or didn't pass the test. And the reality is a lot more complicated than that. So that's one thing that I would just encourage in looking at the results, to try not to fall prey for that kind of a very easy simplification. So instead, I think the things that I would really be paying close attention to, I think you have to obviously report what the results are. You have to report what the differences by subgroups are, right? And whether those percentages, I think, are different by racial ethnic background is very important. Looking at trends for English language learners, or not trend, but looking at sort of the English language learners relative to non-English language learners also seems like an important, just descriptive thing that you need to get out there and setting the baseline. But the things I'd really be trying to pay the closest attention to, and this probably involves more of a qualitative look than anything, are maybe 2 things. Number one, are there any signs of irregularities in the administration of the tests, right? Were there problems in terms of the testing windows? Were schools able to complete the testing without a hitch within the windows? Did they have problems with the technology? Were there security problems? Like these descriptive things are critical. Did everything go off as planned? Or do we see enough evidence that systemically there were problems in the administration? Before we get to anything else, if we can't just pull off the logistics of this sort of thing, that's a problem. A second thing, and this is a thing to really try to capture at the outset here, is to what extent are the tests driving what happens in the classroom? We know teachers are aware of the tests. We know that there is a sense that tests are the canary in the coal mine, that it's likely that as the tests get out there and teachers become more aware of them, they may teach to what is in the assessment. And there's a question here of whether that's a good or a bad thing. If the assessment is really a very, very rich assessment, it could be that teaching to the PARCC test or the Smarter Balanced test is not the worst thing in the world. That said, if you take the practice test, and I just getting ready for today, I wanted to make sure that I had done that. So I took the practice test for PARCC in English Language Arts for grade 11. And if you haven't done that, you should do it. It only took me about an hour or so. This is worth an hour and a half of your time, and just to get a feel for exactly what's going on, what they're asking for in that sort of assessment. And you could see, looking in that, how there could be aspects of those questions that students could answer correctly through process of elimination. Right, and so then the question is that really what we're trying to measure on the test? Is that just a test-taking skill? And to what extent then are you seeing evidence of companies that are selling their services to school districts for test preparation purposes? And are they focusing on surface-level features of the test, right, that emphasize things like process of elimination? I would want to get a sense for, number one, right now, who are companies out there? Are they really aggressively marketing their services? What is it like now? What will it be like a year from now? So you can establish that baseline. What sense do you have of what's going on in the classroom, how the test is influencing instruction? I think that the more qualitative information right now is the most critical information to get out there.
Thanks. We actually had someone earlier walk us through some of the sample items, so we didn't get experience of that. I've got a million more questions, but I'm going to shut up now and let you all ask questions. And to help us get to as many as we can, if you can try to keep your answers to maybe a minute or so,
yes.
that would be great. Who has questions? And please identify yourself. Joy?
Hi, I'm Joy Resmovitz with the Huffington Post. I'm really interested in your work on the alternative consortia. Is there anything you could say about how those tests are different from the previously administered alternative assessments? And would you say that to the extent that there is innovation on the standard test, is it the same level? Is the changes drastic?
Yeah, so I'd say the answer is a little bit different for each of those consortia. I know more about NCSIC being on the technical advisor panel for that than I do about DLM. What I can say about DLM that is potentially very innovative is the idea is they're really trying to leverage technology to give students questions and from there branch off in an almost adaptive way to try to figure out what are the insights we can make about students by building in essentially scaffolding to the students within the computer-based environment. Now we'll see. Like I haven't actually seen that up close, but it's a the way that that's really set up is this idea that there are all these important building block skills, right, that may not yet add up to everything that's in the Common Core, but there still might be elements of those things that we can help students with significant cognitive disabilities to master, and we can figure out questions to ask in that way, and that's where the DLM is trying to accomplish. Now, what I think is maybe most innovative about NCSIC is not so much the items. I'll say something about the items, but it's more, and I know I have to keep this short. What's most innovative about NCSIC is they really have worked very hard on building alignment between not just their items, but a curriculum that would go with those items, right? And professional development for teachers. That's actually the most important thing for the alt assessment. It's just such a sea change for teachers, special education teachers in particular, to be told that you're not just there to teach kids functional skills, but actually academic skills matter for these kids as well. And they can actually achieve them. They can learn a little bit of it. They can learn how to write. They can learn a little bit of mathematics and how to reason. And so it's not just the questions that are so important for NCSIC, but the professional development that they've developed along with it, and also curricula. And you can go, NCSIC has a wiki page of curricula that they've developed that goes with their assessment. And that's really amazing. That's something that doesn't exist for Parker Smarter Balance, but does exist for NCSIC.
Other questions out there? Yep. Again, identify yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Grace Tatter from Chalkbeat, Tennessee, and I was wondering if you had any opinion on, for those of us in states that theoretically will have Common Core line tests, but they're not in the consortia, if there's anything we should be looking for in quality and to make sure that those tests are of the same quality as the ones in the consortia, and then also if you have any thoughts on how different they actually will be. Like in Tennessee, our tests will be developed by Measurement Inc., but they're subcontracting with AIR, which I think also does Smarter Balance. So
Right.
Are the tests all the same even if they're made by different people?
Right.
And just to chime in quickly on this, at this point, according to the great map that Education Week developed, at least 21 states are now not in PARC or Smarter Balance. Remember, at the beginning of the conversation years ago, it was something like 45 plus, or almost all of the states were expected. And now nearly half of them and nearly half of the student population is not in those consortia. So this is a pretty key issue.
Right. It is a key issue. It's actually unclear, though, to what extent all those states will be really developing. I think this is the heart of the question. Are they really going to be developing something different from what is in the Parker Smarter Balance test? There are a couple of great examples. Michigan is no longer a member of the consortia, but they're using Smarter Balanced items and going forward. Indiana is not a part of the consortia, but their test contractor is CTB. CTB helped develop the items for Smarter Balance. And so once again, is it really going to be the case that the items that they're having are really fundamentally different? So that's an interesting question. One thing I would just say to be on the lookout for is the following. A lot of the states that dropped out of the consortium, part of it was related to time and cost. And those things all ring towards performance-based assessment, that they actually, if time and cost is your concern, the first thing to go is performance-based assessment. And so the question is, how is it possible to assess the Common Core state standards, which emphasize, remember, the calling card of that was we're not just going to cover breadth, it's depth too. Depth of knowledge, that's the key thing. So how is it possible to really get a depth of knowledge with just selected response items? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's a real challenge. And so, again, from a face validity standpoint, if you don't have opportunities for students to really express themselves in writing or do performance-based tasks, question is, how can you really, is it possible to get at reasoning, modeling, defending claims with evidence when you just have selected response items? That's sort of the question I would be posing when you talk to people.
Recently, there were 3 states in Smarter Balanced who said that because of, I think, technical glitches, they would not be able to use adaptive testing.
Yeah.
And because of the nature of that problem, it seems realistic to think that other states might have that problem soon. Maybe not, but Smarter Balance says there shouldn't be any major variation in terms of results, in terms of if you have the same student taking the 2 different tests. It shouldn't make a difference. Does that make sense to you? I mean, to me, I sort of think about it when I saw the headline and I wrote about it. What would you say about that in terms of how significant that is in terms of comparisons that can be made between different, in this case, Smarter Balanced states?
Right. So I think the reason for that statement, where they're saying there should still be comparability, is that in terms of coverage of the blueprint of the, what you're trying to capture about the Common Core, that whether the test is adaptive or not adaptive in the cases of the states, you still should still have that coverage. Where the impact comes in, the benefits of adaptive, is that you can much more quickly and efficiently potentially hone in on where a student is on the scale and get a more precise estimate, right? So where you might expect to see and have an impact is on essentially the standard error of measurement around a student's score. You might expect in the cases where they aren't able to do it adaptively, that it's going to be slightly larger, right? But I don't think it's going to be that much larger at this point. It's important to keep in mind that even in the adaptive algorithm, there are constraints in the algorithm. They have to still complete coverage of the blueprint. So they can't just pick the item that is the easiest or hardest for the kid. They have to first say, well, is it an item that satisfies what's left in the blueprint? So when you take those things into account, even when it's fully adaptive, it's never going to be as purely adaptive as it could be if you didn't have those constraints, right? So that's why the difference might not be as large as we initially might have thought it would be.